Hi, I'm Cal with New Gamer Nation. I'm here today with John Bain. You're better known by your online moniker TotalBiscuit.
Yep, that was a silly idea, wasn't it? Oh well,
Total Halibut.
Stuck with it now. Yeah, I don't think one's better than the other, really, is it? They're both pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm fond of Biscuit. I think it has more of a ring to it. But.
Yeah, we can go with that. More sort of cozy, familiar, friendly feel to it.
So you have 2 million subscribers on your
Sure.
YouTube channel, and you were voted trending gamer. You speak a lot about different things within the industry. Very outspoken, not only about games and criticizing them, but about the industry and issues surrounding it.
Yeah.
Now, one of the issues I'm not sure you've spoken at too great a length about is games preservation. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept.
Yep.
So right now, it's currently an issue that's in some amount of legal limbo. Right now, there's a proposed exemption to copyright law, and that's proposed Class 23.
Mm-hmm.
And the Electronic Frontier Fund has suggested that abandonware, which they define as games that developers have ceased server support for a period of at least 6 months, it should be illegal to hack these to redirect them to third-party servers so that people can continue to play the single-player and multiplayer online portions of the game. Now, the intended effect is to just decriminalize this action, but in order to do that, you would have to be able to hack the consoles. So the ESA has argued that removing it would not only allow piracy, but encourage it, effectively decriminalizing piracy as well. Now, do you believe that games preservation is in a state where there should be some change to it, or that there is any actual risk, or this is just a perceived issue that has no real bearing?
It's been an issue for quite some time. You mentioned the term abandonware, and that's been around for a long, long time. I recall that before I even started doing YouTube, I was aware of a site called the Home of the Underdogs, which was essentially a games preservation site. It was the largest abandonware site on the internet, and its stated mission was exactly what you just mentioned. It was preserving titles that were no longer available. It was about trying to set up multiplayer communities for otherwise dead games. And I thought their mission was very important, and unfortunately I believe they don't operate really anymore. The site's still around, but it's not frequently updated. So I first became aware of the issue back then, and that was over 10 years ago. Now it's actually got even worse, and it's mostly due to the fact that we are now dealing with walled garden digital stores and devices which can only access games through those stores. The biggest example is iOS. The only way you can get an iOS game without doing some jailbreaking and sideloading would be to buy it through the iOS store. Now, a couple of weeks ago, EA took a bunch of titles off the store for good. And they did this because they didn't want to continue to pay for the cost of updating it for the latest version of iOS. So these were older games, some of them classics. Real Racing, great example. Flight Control, excellent titles, highly rated, but not really making a lot of money anymore. And those games are now basically gone for good on that platform. There is no way to get them. And, of course, we had the recent issue with PT, for instance, on the PlayStation 4. And right. Konami recently announced, I believe yesterday, that they are pulling all AAA support outside of their soccer series. So we are now in a situation where games have gone increasingly digital, and yet it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually preserve them, and we're having instances of games that are coming up that rely solely on server support from a major publisher who can pull it at any time, and that game can essentially disappear from the internet. And that, to me, is actually a huge issue. That is a consumer rights issue in particular. I do believe that as much as it is said that you only own a license to a game, not an actual physical copy, I think there is a reasonable expectation amongst the consumer that in 5 years they'll be able to pick up the game they bought and actually play it again. And yet, with plenty of titles, they're not able to do that. As regards to the legal side of things, I think the ESA's argument is spurious at best. I believe that they are massively exaggerating the effect of it. The idea that this would encourage piracy, as if piracy wasn't popular enough already. The notion that this would cause them problems. Really, this is about preserving the heritage of a new medium. And I think this should be in the interest of the ESA, who have argued time and time again for the legitimacy of gaming as a serious form of media. Now, how exactly can you have a serious form of media if products within that medium can disappear off the map with no chance of recovery. I mean, think about the notion of films and television suddenly becoming unavailable and there being no method to preserve them. That's ludicrous when you think about it. No one would possibly think that that could happen in the modern age, and yet games are subject to this all the time. So it's a complicated legal situation, but I would always err, of course, on the side of the consumer. And I have to ask, when it comes to the idea of sort of decriminalization, all that sort of thing, it seems to me like a victimless crime. And I think the benefits far outweigh any potential financial risk from any of these publishers.
So the ESA has actually participated in some initiatives. They've worked with, I know, the American Art Museum to acquire several pieces of specifically like Halo 2600 and Flower for permanent display. But they seem extremely adverse to this because they suggest that allowing users to hack the consoles would allow these consoles to run unauthorized third-party code, so they could run pirated code of legitimate games. And in fact, they say that proponents of this proposed class, quote, have not proven that as a result of video game access controls, the prohibition on circumvention is causing, or in the next 3 years, because of this triennial ruling, is likely to cause a substantial adverse effect on those uses, and that any evidence of adverse effects is at best hypothetical. Would you say that that is untrue? Would you say that there are, like you said, clearly delineated cases that server support has ceased? And if so, how do you define this abandonware? The EFF suggests that 6 months is the period, that after that it should be considered abandonware. And the ESA comes back and says, well, look, that's ridiculous because we have developers bringing back games all the time, charging for them again. What would you define that as?
That's a very difficult question because, of course, the 6-month definition to me on first hearing it does seem to be a little extreme. The ESA makes a reasonable point, although what I would say is the ESA is far more interested in their ability to bring forth remastered versions of a game. This has become a business strategy over the past few years. It's a very cheap way of making a lot of extra money, and there's nothing wrong with it on principle. You know, there's a good reason to bring a PlayStation 3 game onto the PlayStation 4 to remaster something like that. I think that the definition is certainly something that needs to be argued over, but I certainly think that abandonware needs to have an official classification and a degree of protection under the law, because many of these companies that are part of the ESA, such as EA, have been notorious for cutting server support. They do it every single year, especially for their regular franchise titles.
There's 150 servers are shut down in 2014, especially sports games.
Absolutely, and not just sports games. There was a title I remember that was very innovative for the time, a collectible strategy game called Battleforge, which EA ran, and the server for that is gone, and what was actually a really fantastic game is literally impossible to play now, and this will keep happening because companies like EA and Ubisoft seem to be more and more obsessed with the notion of connectivity, whether it be to persistently attempt to sell microtransactions, whether it be to attempt to sell DLC to gather information on their users, or to exert some degree of control. And that's what it comes down to, isn't it? It's the idea that publishers cannot relinquish even a shred of control to the user. They're almost terrified of it, I think, which is why perhaps so many games are not providing proper mod support anymore. We've seen Rockstar be involved in several controversial issues involving modding, banning users in certain ways, and deliberately patching their game to make modding more difficult. It becomes a battle of control over who owns the software.
So that's an interesting concept that there are some rather shocking comments. One quote in particular, I was reading this on an airplane. I was going through all these court documents. I was flying out to PAX, and I outlined this, and I passed it back to my coworker who was sitting in the row behind me, and I was just like, what? And they specifically said, it is inaccurate to suggest that multiplayer gameplay is a core function of the video game, or that users acquire rights to access such functionality when they purchase a game. And now the evidence that they use for this is that PSN and Xbox Live are paid services. But this seems like completely insane when you consider how Steam works, how PC gaming works. I mean, do you have any response to that sort of quote?
I mean, that is ludicrous. It depends exactly on which games they were referring to, but I don't think there's any doubt that many AAA titles these days are built around the core of multiplayer. Now, of course, one of the most popular franchises in the world, Call of Duty, is sold on the basis of that yearly multiplayer update. And these companies are also providing multiplayer-only titles. Titanfall by EA is a prime example. They're pushing more and more towards this idea that single-player functionality is not really that important, and you can ship a $60 multiplayer game. And that's a great idea, because that means you've got permanent connectivity. That means you've got an ever-open store to sell you DLC, to sell you microtransactions. It's a reasonable business strategy. So to then turn around and say, well, multiplayer is not core to it, that's incredibly disingenuous. There's no doubt about that. These games are built around multiplayer as a core concept. This is not 10 years ago where multiplayer was an optional little add-on on the side.
Well, you brought up Titanfall. That's all multiplayer, but it's part of what they talked about because they excluded MMOs. They said that that's a persistent world that remains static even when users log out. Titanfall is not that.
No, it's not.
And they're saying it's paperweight, essentially.
Yeah, and what about all of their free-to-play games? Recent example, EA shut down Dawngate, which was an upcoming... It was in open beta, but let's be honest, that term doesn't really mean anything anymore when you have a cash shop. That game was out, everybody could access it, it had a cash shop, people paid money into that game, and then that game was suddenly shut down without warning, and was there any reasonable compensation given? Absolutely not. And it is a rising issue with free-to-play. It is continuing to be a problem, and at some point, I think someone is going to have to step in and define what the reasonable limit is. What is the reasonable expectation of you as a consumer when it comes to access to that service, and should there be compensation provided if you pay for virtual goods and then the service that you need in order to use them suddenly shuts down?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, John.
Pleasure, man.
Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you.